Welcome to the Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to be still working with events in ActionScript 3, but this tutorial will be on the Enter Frame event in ActionScript 3. In ActionScript 2, dealing with the Enter Frame event was actually relatively simple. The developer created a timeline function called Enter Frame, and every time the frame began, the function was automatically called. In ActionScript 3, the developer has much more control over the events in the Swift movie file, but with that additional control comes a little bit more work in accessing them. The Enter Frame event is used when you want to have a function repeatedly fire throughout the execution of your code. There are two basic ways of animating objects programmatically in ActionScript 3. Using the timer class, which we've already discussed in a previous tutorial, and using the Enter Frame event, which we're about to discuss in this tutorial. As we discussed in the previous group of tutorials on timer events, the Event Dispatcher class handles all events in ActionScript 3. In fact, in ActionScript 3, the Event Dispatcher is a base class for all interactive objects. Just as in the mouse events and timer events in previous tutorials, using the Enter Frame event, you must tell the application to listen for that event, and you must specify which method you want to occur when the event is detected. It's my opinion that this consistency in the development of the code structure, though a little more difficult to initially learn, will allow the developer to much more rapidly acquire a good knowledge of the programming aspects of ActionScript 3 once the basic concepts are learned. And I actually believe that this consistency in the way that they've developed ActionScript 3 with all the different events that are available actually makes it much, much better once you grasp how these objects work and how this programming works. It makes it much easier to grasp the entire concept of ActionScript 3. So listen for that on Enter Frame is consistent with the other events that we've covered. And we're going to have an event listener, just like we've done with our mouse events and our timer events. An important concept to keep in mind when using the on Enter Frame event is that the event is triggered by the settings that have been set in the properties of the Flash file. And we'll go through that as we go through these labs. In other words, the frame rate that you've set in the properties panel of the Flash movie will be the rate at which the on Enter Frame event fires in your ActionScript code. Because keep in mind that frame rate is determining how often we enter frames inside of ActionScript 3. This tutorial will cover the on Enter Frame event, and once again we'll add a dynamic sprite to our stage for this demonstration. So we're just going to practice that once again using dynamic graphics or sprites inside of ActionScript 3 and generate that through code. As I discussed in previous tutorials, the use of sprites dynamically added to the stage allows the developer to attain much more control over the application and the file size of the application once it's completed. This is a concept that we'll continue to build on throughout the remaining tutorial series on the essentials of ActionScript 3 and Flash. So let's review the Enter Frame syntax. Again, we've got the stage. In this particular instance, I'm actually having the stage have an event listener, and it's listening for an Enter Frame event. And when that event occurs, it's going to run a method or a function called onEnter. So as we covered in both the mouse events and the timer events from the previous tutorials, we notify the event dispatcher to listen for our event. And in this case, I'm telling the stage, I'm adding an event listener to that stage, and it's listening for an event, and the event it's listening for is the Enter Frame event. Here's where we tell the event dispatcher what type of event it's listening for. This designation is followed by a comma, and now we specify what method or function we want to call when the event occurs. And you should be very familiar with this by now, because this is the same syntax setup that we've used in our previous events as we were listening for them, both in the mouse events and in our timer events. If you've been following along in the previous tutorials, this syntax should look very familiar. The syntax for the mouse events and the timer events was very similar to what we just discussed. So let's go ahead and move into our development environment and work through some exercises on the Enter Frame event in ActionScript 3. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation, get into our development environment, and let me bring up Flash Professional. I've got my standard branding on my stage, as we always do in this tutorial. We're going to discuss using the onEnter Frame event in ActionScript 3. The first thing we want to remember is that the onEnter Frame event update is linked to the properties of our Flash panel. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Right here in the properties of the file itself, I have this frame rate. In fact, right now I'm going to set it at 15. This frame rate is what determines how often that on-enter frame event occurs in ActionScript 3. So based on how many frames per second we have firing is how often that on-enter frame event is going to fire also. I'm going to go ahead and leave that at 15 and go ahead and close this for now. We'll be playing with that throughout this demonstration. So the speed at which the on-enter frame event occurs is based on the setting that we gave our Flash file and the frame rate of the movie file. Okay, so let's set up our stage. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to add another layer to our timeline right above my branding layer. I'm going to go ahead and insert another layer, and I want to call this graphics. And then right above that layer, I'm going to insert an actions layer. I'm going to go ahead and lock that actions layer. I want to select frame one of the graphics layer. And I'm actually going to move one of our little graphics onto my stage. I'm going to see if it's in my file. I don't believe it is. Nope, it is not. So I'm going to go ahead and grab one of my graphics. And I'm just going to grab that helicopter graphic that we've used in previous exercises. And I'm just going to drag that onto my stage. And what I'm going to do once I get on the stage, I'm going to use F8 so I can convert that to a symbol. And I'm just going to call it MC Helicopter. And again, this will add this to our library. I'm going to keep my registration point in the center. Click OK. And now inside of our library, you'll see we've got this MC Helicopter movie clip. And I'm just going to put that in the upper left-hand corner for now. And I want to give it an instance name. So I'm going to go ahead and make certain it's selected, make certain I'm on the graphics layer, open up my properties panel, and give this an instance name of HELI1_MC. And again, you remember I used the prefixes to let me know that that's a movie clip inside my ActionScript code. Hit enter, so now I've given it an instance name. I've got it on my stage in the upper left-hand corner, and that's what we're going to work with first. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as on this particular file, and I am going to save this as 1013_work1. It's going to be my work1 FLA file, and go ahead and save that change. This way we're not overwriting our branding file. Now I want to go ahead and select frame one of my actions layer. I want to go ahead and open up my actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in the Macintosh. And I want to enter a little bit of code that we're going to use to actually make this, give you a demonstration of how this enter frame event works. So the first thing I want to do is enter my stop, because we want to stop the actual timeline. Actually, this will be, I don't think, only the second time we've actually really needed to stop, because we actually are now going to be moving some animation on our stage. I'm going to skip a line, put down stage.addEventListener. So I've got my add event listener, and again, I'm listening for an event. And this event that I'm listening for is an enter frame event, all caps, underscore, and then frame. I want to put my comma, and we're going to run what's called move, HELI. That's going to be the name of the function we're going to create, close parentheses, and then that comment or statement with a semicolon. So I've got stage.addEventListener, so I'm adding an event listener to my stage. I'm listening for my enter frame event, and when that event occurs, I'm going to trigger a method or a function. In this case, my function is going to be called moveHeli. So then when I want to come down, let's go ahead and skip a couple lines and just create that function. It's going to be a relatively simple function. Open and closing parentheses. I don't know why I have an opening parentheses before my name, but I've got function moveHeli. EVT is going to be my temporary variable. It's going to store that. I'm having problems with my parentheses today. Put my colon, and it's listening again for that event. No expected return, so I'm going to go ahead and avoid the return. Opening and closing curly braces. Come down the line and just say HELI1_MC. Remember, that's the name that we actually gave the helicopter. .y plus equal .4. So what we're doing is we're actually just moving him on the y-axis. And if you remember, the plus equal means take the current value and add 0.4 to it. That's why we did the plus equal. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Good time to pause if you need to type that in, and then we'll talk about this code. The first thing I want you to notice is that no interaction is required to trigger our on-enter frame event. There are no buttons, no mouse clicks, etc. Unlike the previous examples that we've demonstrated, it ran as soon as we're going to begin this application. This on-enter-frame event is going to run. So we're not actually doing anything like we've done in the previous exercises to trigger it. The frame itself, the frame rate, is going to trigger it. This event is being triggered by the application entering the frame of the movie. So let's go ahead and test it, and then we'll talk the rest of this. I'm going to do a Control-Enter and Windows Command Return on the Mac to test the movie, and you notice now we see the helicopter slowly working its way down our stage. And again, we didn't have to have any interaction for this to occur because we're actually triggering it off the enter frame event, and we added that event listener to the stage itself. So it's listening for whenever that enter frame event is updating, which in this case is 15 frames per second. It's actually executing the code that's inside of our function. So as usual, we entered our familiar stop method to stop the timeline from moving forward in the event we had multiple frames in our movie. Notice that even though there's only one frame in the movie, the frame rate still proceeds. It is constantly reloading frame 1 since that's the only frame that is available. That's a good thing to keep in mind for programming. You don't have to have multiple frames for these frame rates to continually go. Then we added our event listener. Notice that it's not triggered by anything other than the application. Inside the event listener, we identified our function that we wanted executed each time the application enters the frame. This is the same type of syntax that we used in our previous tutorials on mouse events and timer events. We named our function moveHeli. The function merely moves our helicopter down the y-axis of the stage. Remember, y is the vertical axis, x is the horizontal axis. So let's go ahead and save all these changes to our work. And again, I'm going to go ahead and test the movie one more time so you can see what we've done, and then we'll get ready to move into our next demonstration. Remember now, we're updating this every 15 times per second as it works through this, and we're moving it down 0.4 pixels every time the application enters the frame. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that. Now let's try something else. Let's change the frame rates on the properties panel to 25. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my properties panel. Remember, we've got our frame rate set at 15. Let's set this at 25 and see what happens to our movie. I'm going to go ahead and save the changes. Close my properties panel. Let's go ahead and test our movie, controlling Windows Command Return on the Mac. Notice the difference in the speed. See, now it's coming down much, much quicker. And again, it's because now it's executing 25 times per second instead of 15. Let's go ahead and change it one more time. This time, let's change it to 50 frames per second. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Refresh the browser. I'm going to go test the movie, Control-Enter on Windows, Command Return on the Mac. And now you can see a noticeable difference in the speed at which it's dropping, because now it's actually executing 50 times per second that we're actually going through the enter frame event and running this function. So notice the difference in the speeds. As we increase the speeds, we're tasking the processor with additional tasks. There comes a point where the trade-off does not justify the speed increase. Based on current processors, the optimum settings for animation using the on-enter frame event inside of Flash is somewhere between 24 and 30 frames per second. Based on the many variables of the hardware configurations available, keep in mind that you need to be aware of the user's hardware development when you're actually doing this. It's not so much based on your stuff, because obviously you could have some really high-end stuff as you develop all these applications. You want to base all this stuff on the average type of systems that your users are going to have. So let's go ahead and change our frame rate back to 15, because that's where we're going to leave it for this particular demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. So now we're going to build an application that uses a ball and it drops it onto our stage. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the properties panel. Let's move into a second demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and remove the helicopter from our stage. We're not going to use that for this particular example. I'm going to go ahead and select frame 1 of my actions layer. Let's go ahead and open up that actions panel. F9 in Windows, Option F9 in the Mac. What I want to do now is I actually want to go ahead and create a ball from a sprite on our stage. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the code from our previous example. I'm going to go ahead and pull all this out. Let's go ahead and do a save as. I want to save this as work2 1013 underscore work2.fla. So in the event you have access to the exercise file, you'll have all these files available. And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some code that's actually going to add a sprite onto our stage. So I'm going to go ahead again, open up, select frame 1 of the actions layer, open up the actions panel. First thing I want to type in is stop. We want to stop any movement on our timeline. I want to create a variable. I want the variable to be called ball. I want it data typed as a sprite. I want this equal to a new sprite class. And I want to end that with a semicolon. And then what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to add the code that's going to create this graphic or this sprite on our stage. So right below that, I'm going to go ahead and put ball.graphics.beginFill, and I'm going to assign the begin fill color for our ball. Then right below that, I'm actually going to draw the circle, and we've done this before in previous exercises. So now I'm going to say ball.graphics.drawCircle 50, 50, 15. If you remember from previous exercises, it actually draws that graphic on our stage. Again, it's not there yet because we haven't placed it, but we're actually drawing it. Then I'm going to come down right below that. I want to draw ball.graphics.endFill. This is where we actually end the fill for the ball itself. And then we're actually going to add the ball to our stage, and that's where we can actually see it. So I'm going to say stage.addChild, and then I'm going to add that ball, which has now we've created graphically using our sprite class to our stage. Let's go ahead and save those changes on that work2 file. I'm going to come down here just a second just to make sure that we're in the work2 file, and we are. It's not what I wanted to do with the actions layer. All right, let's go ahead and save all those changes. Now what I want to do, let's go ahead and talk through this real quick. Let me test the movie so you can see what we've actually done, because what we've actually done now is we've created this sprite on our stage. I'm going to do a Control-Enter in Windows, Command-Return in the Mac. And we just have this, we've created this green ball on our stage. I'm not doing anything yet because we actually haven't done anything with it. We've just physically created it. But as explained in an earlier tutorial, we begin generating more graphics on our stage using the sprite class of ActionScript 3. This is much more efficient for file size. It gives us much better control of the graphic and allows us to add and remove the graphic all through ActionScript. And keep in mind, there's only certain things that we can do with the sprites, but when they're available, we should use them because they actually do keep our code quite lean and mean for loading. Keep in mind that sprite's nothing more than a movie clip that has a single frame. As such, it's much smaller in size and reacts much quicker to changes in the programming environment. What we've done with this code is create a green ball in the upper left corner of the stage using nothing but ActionScript. The stop method stops the timeline from moving past frame 1, as we've done in all our previous exercises. The next line of code creates the variable ball, which we have data typed as a sprite. This is a very small file size and easy to manipulate with ActionScript. In the next line of code, we set up the fill color for our ball variable. This one happens to be green. That's 00FF00. And again, we can use any of the colors, any of the hexadecimal values for colors that we'd want. The next line of code actually draws our sprite and assigns an X and Y position and a radius, and that's what this is, 50, 50, 15. I've got an X position of 50 pixels, a Y position of 50 pixels, and a radius of 15. If we go ahead and test the movie, you can actually see that. If I were to change the size of the ball, I could just actually change the radius. Make this 30, save that change, and again, it's X, Y, radius. Now when we test it again, it's twice as big as it was in the previous exercise. I'm going to send it back to 15. Let's go ahead and undo that. Let's go ahead and make this back to 15. Save the change, but again, X, the first number, the first value is X, the second value is Y, the third value is the actual diameter itself. The next line of code ends the fill color based on the parameters that we set for the circle size, and that's based on that draw circle size. Finally, the AddChild command places the sprite on the stage. Remember, prior to that command, the sprite had been created. It just resides in memory, but nothing had been added to the stage. And again, we've tested our movie, so we know that our sprite is working, which is kind of cool. Now let's add some dimensions to our graphic to make it more realistic for our demonstration. We'll get a little more creative with our dynamic generation of the sprite by adding a couple of filters to the sprite. So again, I'm still inside my Actions panel. And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some filtering to this pipe. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to create a variable. Let's come down 2 lines below this. This variable is going to be called the drop shadow, and I'm actually going to bring in the drop shadow filter class, and I'm actually going to assign a drop shadow filter to this. And again, I've just left a line just for clarity. Then I'm actually going to create a gradient glow. Normally we wouldn't use these at the same time. I just want to show you how we can actually do this programmatically through ActionScript 3. So now I'm creating a variable called gradient glow, and again, it's data typed as a gradient glow filter class, and I'm generating a new gradient glow filter. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start assigning the values for that. So I'm going to come right down below that, and I'm going to say gradient glow dot distance, and that's going to be equal to 5 pixels. Then I'm going to set up the angle for the gradient glow, and I'm going to come right below that, gradient glow angle equal 120. So now we're looking at the angle in degrees. I'm going to go ahead and move this up because I know we're going to get some more stuff in here, and I want to expand this panel a little bit so you can easily see this, and then I'll give you a second to type this in when you need to. Then right below the gradient glow angle, we're going to set up the gradient glow dot colors, and we're actually setting up the colors now, the 2 colors that we're going to use to actually generate this glow. And I'm going to set up my alphas for the gradient glow. Come right below that, and I'm setting up the gradient glow dot alphas, and again, these are all properties of this gradient glow class that we're setting up. Then I'm going to set up my ratio. Control V to paste that in, gradient glows dot ratio 0,255, and we'll talk about all this as we get down and get this all entered in. Now I'm going to put in the strength of my glow, so my gradient glow dot strength. Then I'm going to put in my quality of the glow, gradient glow dot quality equal bitmap filter quality dot high, so it's going to be a high quality glow. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes because we're almost finished, and then we'll discuss these. Then I'm going to come right below the quality, and actually I want to put in the gradient glow dot type, and it's going to be a bitmap filter type outer, so it's going to be an outer glow. And now here's where I'm going to actually assign it. So right below the type, I'm actually going to assign ball.filters equal, and this is where I assign the drop shadow that we created and the gradient glow that we just created to my ball, and it becomes part of the filters property for the ball that we created in the previous demonstration. Then what I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and take this, and now that I've added this to it, I'm going to come down, skip, and I'm going to add that to the stage, and I want to make sure I remove this stage edge child up here because I don't actually want to add the ball to the stage until after now we've created the drop shadow and the gradient glow to it. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. We're going to talk about all this code in a minute. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this stuff in. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this as work file number 3. Have all those changes in it. So now that we've entered through ActionScript a drop filter and a gradient glow to our new sprite, these additional lines of code add a new level of control to our created sprite. There are additional options or parameters that could be added that we'll discuss in future tutorials, but I mean, these are just some of the parameters and properties that are available with this gradient glow class. And there's a lot of stuff going on now in ActionScript 3 that we can do dynamically. All the filters available through the Properties panel are available through ActionScript. So anything that we can do in the Properties panel of an item, we can actually do through ActionScript. Let's go ahead and test this movie. I want to make sure we've got all our changes saved, just so you can see what we've done with this. I'm going to go ahead and collapse that. Let's go ahead and test the movie. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. And you can see now we've got this glow and this drop shadow now around this little green ball that we've created. If I modify the ball, if I come up here and say make it 30, so if I modify the size, because this is all done dynamically now, it's all done through code, retest our movie, you'll notice now everything resizes proportionately with it because it's all based on that sprite that we created with the ball itself. And that's where we're assigning this gradient glow and this drop shadow. We come in here to the ball filters property and assign those to that ball, so they take on the characteristics of the ball. It's kind of cool the way all this stuff works with these sprites. I really like it. I mean, I think they've come a long way with ActionScript 3. Now let's go back to our enter frame event. Let's change the frame types. I'm going to go into my properties panel. I'm going to go ahead and change my frames to 30 frames per second. And that's recommended. 24 to 30 is recommended for good animation. We're going to leave it there for the rest of the tutorial. I want to go ahead back into my actions panel. I'm going to select frame 1 of the actions layer. I'm going to open up my actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in the Mac. And let's go ahead and add some additional stuff to our code. I'm going to go ahead and pull a lot of these parameters out. Actually, no, I'm not. I was going to go ahead and pull them out. I don't need to do that. I'm just going to come down here and let's go ahead and add an event listener. So I'm going to have my stage add event listener just like we'd done in the previous exercise. So right below where we've added that ball to the stage, I'm going to add an event listener for our stage. Somehow I lost my ST in there. And I'm going to come down a couple lines and then create the method or function that we're going to use. It's actually going to trigger when that occurs. So I'm going to create a function and it's going to be called moveBall. And again, it's listening for that add enter frame event. And I'm going to move my ball on the Y and the X axis 4 pixels as we go through this. Let's go ahead and save the changes. I'm going to do a save as on this. Let's go ahead and save this as work file 4 inside our work files folder. I'm going to go ahead. Here we've added an event listener to our action script that's triggered as soon as the flash files run. And again, just like we had done in the previous exercise, this enter frame event is going to be triggered as soon as we test this flash file. Every time we enter that frame, it's going to trigger this event. This code moves our sprite on the X and Y axis 8 pixels every time the function's triggered. This is occurring 30 times per second, so I'm moving it 4 on the Y and 4 on the X. That's how I came up with the 8. Notice the ball moves off the stage. There are a couple different ways that we could correct this, but the simplest way is to add a conditional statement to our function. Let's just go ahead and test this so I can show you what I mean, but it actually is going to move our ball off the stage. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. And now we're moving it both on the X and the Y axis using that enter frame event. And when it gets down to the bottom, you'll see we're going to lose it. It's just going to go off the stage and out of sight. Nice smooth animation because we're using that 30 frames per second. But you'll notice now as the ball moves out of sight, it's actually off our frame. And just looking at the frame itself, you'd never know that anything was going on now because we've actually lost the ball from the stage itself. So again, there are ways that we could correct this with a conditional statement. And that's what we're going to look at some different ways to do that in the next exercise. All right, so let's go back into our actions panel. We remember that we just tested this movie now and we watched our ball move off the stage, not exactly what we wanted. So what I want to do is I just want to make a couple small modifications to our code inside this function where we've got this move ball function. I've got this move ball, so what I want to do is let's go ahead and add some stuff to our function. I'm going to pull the code that's in there out, and we're going to talk about this one line at a time as we add it. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to put in a couple of trace statements. And again, we know that we don't need trace statements to execute our code, but they actually make it a little easier for us as we're troubleshooting code that we write. So I'm going to say traceball.x and traceball.y. That's going to trace the X and Y coordinates of my ball as we update it on the enter frame event. The next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and put in a conditional statement. So I'm going to put in an if statement, and I'm going to come right down below where I'm doing my trace, and I'm going to put in this if statement. I'm saying if the ball.x is less than 320 and the ball.y is less than 320, I want it to do something. And the first thing I want it to do is I want it to take my ball.y. Actually, let's go ahead and just put in both the conditions that we want it to do. So the first thing I want to happen if we fall into those conditions is I want my ball.y plus or minus 8 and my ball.x plus or minus 8. So we're actually adding to the values that they're currently at. Then that's the first condition I want to end. So I'm going to say, okay, and then end that condition else. So if that condition does not evaluate to true, what do I want you to do? Else, I want you to do 15. Control C. So I'm going to come down here and say, I want you to equal ball.y15, ball.x15. So if this isn't true, if I can't add these 8 pixels to that, I want you to reposition my ball back at 15. And then what I want you to do is I want you to remove the event listener. So in other words, we've completed the run with this. It's done. We can't do any more. I want you to run that code, and then I want you to remove my event listener. So remove the event listener for my move ball. I've got one too many curly braces here. I want to go ahead and save all those changes. Good time for you to pause if you want to go ahead and type this stuff in. Only modifications we made is actually to the function itself. I'm going to go ahead and clean up my code a little bit too. Let me bring these back to where they should be. So basically all we've done in this, we've added trace statements to the x and y coordinates of the ball as we're updating them. Then inside the function, we're telling if the ball.x is less than 320 pixels on the x-axis and less than 320 pixels on the y-axis. And again, we're basing this on our stage size. I want you to add 8 pixels to each one of those and just keep animating the ball. If that evaluates false, in other words, if it's no longer true, if it's greater than 320 on the x and the y-axis, I want you to take the ball, put it back at 1515, and then remove the event listener from the ball. And it's just going to basically start it all over again. So we created our sprite, then added additional code to move the sprite monitor in a current location. We added trace statements just so you could see the actual x and y locations of the sprite as it moves across the stage. This also helped me determine during the testing what values to enter into my if statement, because when I was actually doing the original testing, this is how I determined that I wanted to use 320. Changes to the x and y velocity are made for the purpose of speeding up the demonstration, but as you can see, as the speed is increased, the animation becomes much smoother. That's the only reason I went to 8, by the way, so we didn't have to wait so long for this to occur. And our if statement checks the current location of the sprite and compares 2 values. When those values become true, they execute the else portion of the code. The next group of tutorials begins looking at conditional statements, and you're going to see how we use these more and more, because we're going to actually get into conditional statements in the next group of tutorials. Let's go ahead and test this movie. Control Enter Windows Command Return on the Mac. And again, now you'll see that we're tracing the x and y coordinates. It's actually going across our stage. It does look a little bit smoother since we're doing it 8 pixels at a time, but as it gets close to that 320, you can watch that coming up right in here. You'll notice it's going to reset, and it goes back to 1515, and it's going to do that cycle all over again. Again, as it gets into the 320 range, x and y, it's going to reset back to 1515, and that's how we've set up our code to operate. So it's pretty cool. I mean, what we've done is actually pretty cool. Using that in a frame event, we've added some animation, and now we've actually set up our work so that when it gets close to the edge of the stage, based on the values of the x and y coordinates of the ball, it resets back to 1515 and starts that animation all over again. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. The next group of tutorials are going to get into conditional statements in ActionScript 3. And with conditional statements, there's a lot more things that we can do inside of ActionScript. I'm going to go ahead and save our work. I'm going to save this as work file 5. In the event you have access to the exercise folders, you'll have different versions of this throughout. And I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. All right, so real quick, let's go ahead and review what we've covered inside this enter frame event in ActionScript 3. We talked about and discussed the on-enter frame event in ActionScript 3. We linked the on-enter frame event to the stage itself so we could actually get some animation going on our Flash stage. We demonstrated how to generate an animated effect with the on-enter frame event using our helicopter symbol. If you remember the very first demonstration, we actually brought that down the stage as the on-enter frame event was triggered. We dynamically created a sprite on the stage, and we actually this time started to use some properties of the sprite itself. We actually added a drop shadow and a glow effect to the sprite, and for the first time in the tutorial series, we attached filters to our sprite. And you're going to see a lot more of that as we move through the tutorial series. We're going to start getting more and more into these classes that are available for both ActionScript and for the sprites. We animated a sprite using the on-enter frame event, and that was towards the end of the previous tutorial where we just started moving the ball that we created dynamically around on our stage. And then we utilized an if statement to reset our sprite at a starting position and removed an event listener. And that's something you need to get used to as you start doing animation. You want to make certain you remove these event listeners, because if you don't, they're actually going to build up inside your processing. and you'll just have tons and tons of stuff going on in the background. So as an event listener is no longer needed, we want to remove it from our stage to clear out that memory and clear out that process. Even if we're recreating it right away, we want to go ahead and remove the old one and then recreate the new one, which is what we actually demonstrated with that last demonstration. Using that conditional statement, we actually removed the event listener from our stage as that sprite was repositioned to 1515, but then that automatically triggered that conditional statement to start running again. So we actually removed it and created a brand new one as the function regenerated itself with that new movement of the sprite. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.